Thanks, James. Thank you and Mark for inviting me. It's a great, I've just loved Ivana and Marie this morning, and I hope to stay in that same kind of stream of energy, critical and transformative energy that they've brought. I am just delighted to be on the traditional territory, that Treaty 4 and 6, Cree First Nations. And I was very moved by and appreciated the welcome to the land from Life Speaker Neil Starblanket. I'm a settler Canadian, as will be obvious to many. And I live and work on the traditional territory of the Coast and Straits Salish First Nations, specifically on the unceded territory of the Lekwungen and Wasanich First Nations peoples. And when I acknowledge the territory, it's more than just a nod to a respectful relationship or a way of responding to protocol that we are developing. I'm literally standing here as a professor from the University of Victoria as a direct result of my great-grandparents obtaining 200 acres of Halalt First Nations traditional territory on Vancouver Island through illegal means in the last quarter of the 19th century. Prior to the acquisition of this rich and productive land, my settler ancestors were landless and poor, having traveled from England to Australia, then to eastern Canada, and finally to Vancouver Island in search of a way to support themselves and their children. Those 200 acres of Halalt traditional territory transformed my family into middle-class citizens, and the taking of that land created poverty among the generation, my generation, on the First Nations side of the Halalt First Nations people. So when I say these kinds of things, I'm speaking from profound knowledge of the precise way in which I've benefited from that privilege and from that colonial stealing of other people's territory. I'm really honored to be able to follow on Ivana and her very poetic depiction of the horrors, the nightmare of neoliberalism, and Marie Baptiste's expose, really lovely expose of Eurocentric knowledge. And I want to share with you, I'm going to start with some knowledge stories. But before doing that, I want to talk a little bit about the concept of knowledge and dispossession. We've talked about it on the land. I know I've referred to my own case. The geographer David Harvey has elaborated a concept called accumulation through dispossession. And David's theory is that the origins of capitalism, were facilitated by the taking of other people's land, and thereby being able to get the benefits, turn common land into private property. And dispossessing the people of access of their land, he suggests, lies at the very heart of early capitalist accumulation. Harvey draws attention to the process in the 14th through the 17th century England, which we know as historically as the Enclosures. He tells us of wealthy landowners who used force and even arms to transform the traditional open fields and communal pastures into private property for their own profit. Each of these acts of dispossession left the majority of people without access to land and allowed for wealth to accumulate to those who are now known as private landowners. New categories of people were defined: the landed gentry, the workers on the estates, and the workers on the land, and the landless. Lest you think that these acts went unnoticed by ordinary people, here are the words from an English rhyme of the period. The law condemns the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leaves the greater felon loose who steals the common from the goose. What does this have to do with knowledge? A couple of years ago, I spent some time in one of the colleges in Oxford. It was a college created around the same time as the Enclosures were created. And some of you who've been to these kinds of universities, these medieval universities, will recognize the architecture. I entered the college through a low doorway, only accessible to students and fellows and their guests. The college was walled in and accessible only through one or two guarded entryways. While staying in the college, the linkage between the enclosing of previously common land for private purposes and the creation of walled spaces for learning became disturbingly apparent. The act of creating Oxford and the other medieval universities was an act of enclosing knowledge, limiting access to knowledge, exerting a form of control over knowledge, and providing the means for a small elite to acquire this knowledge for purposes of leadership, of a spiritual nature, or governance, of a governance nature, or of a cultural nature. Those within the walls became knowers. Those outside the wall became non-knowers. Knowledge was then removed from the land and from the relationships of those sharing the land. The enclosing of the academy dispossessed the vast majority of knowledge keepers, forever regulating their knowledge to witchcraft, tradition, superstition, folkways, or at best some form of common sense. Now let me get to the knowledge stories. First story is about a young Indian academician by the name of Rajesh Tandon, who was educated in the elite universities of India and the USA, and he found himself deep in rural Rajasthan working as a researcher with tribal farmers on rural development issues. He found on every single issue of rural development that he encountered that the unschooled women and men in rural Rajasthan were more knowledgeable than he. Not marginally so, but greatly so. A few years later, when he had the opportunity, he created a non-governmental research organization that today is known as PRIA, the Society for Participatory Research in Asia. Also in India, a few years later, something called the Honeybee Network was created in the state of Gujarat. It's a knowledge network created to countering what people noted as the pernicious culture of knowledge asymmetry. Knowledge asymmetry, they maintain, occurs when the people who provide knowledge do not benefit from the gathering and organizing of that knowledge. Knowledge, they said, has been extracted, documented, without any acknowledgement to the source. The documented knowledge has not been communicated back to the knowledge holder for feedback. Those practices have not only impoverished the knowledge holders by pushing them further down into oblivion, but have also hampered the growth of an informal knowledge system that might be robust in nurturing creativity. They called their project the Honeybee Knowledge Network, based on the metaphor of the honeybee, which does two things that scholars often don't do. The honeybee collects pollen from the flowers without exploiting or hearing a complaint. And it connects flower to flower through pollination so that in the end life itself continues. Another story. In the late 1990s, a Ugandan intellectual, civil society activist by the name of Paulo Wangola returned home to his kingdom of Busoga after 25 years' work in various parts of Africa to report on the state of the world as he had experienced it. His message to his elders was as follows: "You sent me out, one of the lesser young men of my generation, to gain Western knowledge and to work in the structures and organizations of the Western world. I've been to their universities, I've worked with their governments, I've created some Western-style organizations here in Africa, and now I've come home to share what I have learned. I've come to tell you that we, the children of Busoga Kingdom, the children of Africa, will never realize our full potential as people in our communities and as contributors to the global treasury of knowledge if we continue to depend wholly on the content and ways of knowledge of the European people. Our way forward must be linked to the recovery, replenishment, and revitalization of our thousands of years old Indigenous knowledge. In 2005, Durban, South Africa, some of the inhabitants of the tin-roofed shacks in the cities called Mjondolo, that's the name for those kinds of shacks. You've seen them either in person or on television, created a blockade on a road called Kennedy Road to protest the sale of land originally promised to the poor for house building. But the land instead was sold to an industrialist to build some kind of a big mall. This movement, the movement of those people living in the shack, has grown into something called Abalale Base Mjondolo, the shack dwellers movement. But what is unique to this social movement is that they have created their own University of Abalale Base Mjondolo, a space for the creation about survival, hope and transformation, where the shack dwellers themselves are the scholars, the professors, and the teachers. They create and share knowledge through song, through what they call live action debates and discussions, and they document their knowledge on a web-based archive, which you can look up. My final story begins with a young Indigenous woman from the Lillooet First Nation. She happens to be the woman Marie, one of the women Marie mentioned in terms of the work on the Accord, the Educational Accord. In the 1960s, she was chosen by her community to work as a research guide to a non-Indigenous linguist who had expressed an interest in working on the development of an alphabet for the Stachmek language. She was successful in this challenge, and her people have made use of this alphabet since that time. By 2015, this woman is a leading authority on Indigenous languages in Canada, and her name is, as we heard from Marie, Lorna Williams. She's become a leading scholar in Indigenous language revitalization. But the fate of the language of her community and the languages of so many British Columbia and other Indigenous languages has not fared so well. The impact of colonial domination of Western knowledge traditions has resulted in linguicide, the death or near death of those carriers of our global cultural heritage. Now, in each of the stories that I have shared with you, knowledge is central. Knowledge is the star in each of these dramas. Knowledge is dynamic, active, engaged, linked to social, political, cultural, and sustainable changes. Priya's co-construction of knowledge is linked to a variety of social movements. Mpombo's mother tongue scholars are stimulating an unprecedented reawakening of African spiritual knowledge. The shack dwellers of Durban and beyond have boldly taken the word university as their own and turned the knowledge hierarchies upside down in service of the justice for the poor. The Indigenous language champions working with the First Peoples Cultural Council have staked a claim to epistemological privilege over the Western-trained non-Indigenous linguists. These knowledge innovators have all facilitated various means of creating, sharing, and accessing knowledge that is not part of what is often called the Western canon, or as Marie said, Eurocentric knowledge, the monopoly. For a variety of justice, cultural, spiritual, environmental, health, the application of knowledge from the Western canon in each of these stories was seen as insufficient. The context, conditions, values, uses, politics of knowledge in each of these stories called for an opening outwards of our comfortable assumptions about whose knowledge counts and what the relationship between knowledge and life might be. So the question that I have been puzzling with, how in the world did this happen? What were the steps? I did my own research on my own, how my family got somebody else's land. How did this Western knowledge thing come about? And I've just run into a couple of authors who have been helping me in that. A person called Grossfogel, a person called Dussel, they're both Latin Americans, and Boaventura de Sousa Santos, Portuguese sociologist. They have been helping me to understand how the ideas of white men, from just a few countries actually, from Italy, France, Germany, England, the USA, came to dominate the world of knowledge. To understand that, we have to look at what Grossfogel calls the 4 genocides or the 4 epistemicides of the long 16th century. It seems that the story of dispossessing the people from the ownership of their ideas in the medieval universities that brought ecclesiastical power to the new universities was just the start of our knowledge story. Grossfogel pulls 4 distinct stories of epistemicide, stories almost always treated as separate historical processes together, and in doing so shows us the powerful manner of how intellectual colonization has actually emerged. What are the 4 epistemicides? The 4 epistemicides, that's the killing of knowledge systems, epistemicides, are the conquest of Al-Andalus, was the expulsion of the Muslims and Jews from the Iberian Peninsula and elsewhere in Europe. The conquest of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, started by the Spanish, continued by the French and the English, and still underway today in contemporary Western Hemisphere. The creation of the trades of the slave trade that resulted in millions killed in Africa and at sea, and more totally dehumanized by enslavement in the Americas. It was a 3rd genocidal knowledge conquest. And finally, the killing of millions of Indo-European women, mostly through burning at the stakes as witches because of the knowledge practices that were not controlled by men. And this is a practice, if you've been reading the papers recently, that is still unfortunately happening in some parts of the world. What is important for us to understand is that these 4 conquests were both military and epistemological or ideological. At the height of the Al-Andalus Empire in Europe, the city of Cordoba had a 500,000 book library. This was at a time when other intellectual centers in Europe would have had libraries of anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 books. The Spanish burned the library in Cordoba and elsewhere. They destroyed most of what are known as the codices of the Mayan, Inca, and Aztec empires as well. Women's knowledge, which was largely oral, was simply silenced, as was the knowledge of Africa. African slaves were portrayed as non-humans, incapable of Western-style thought. Hegel, who previously to reading this quote I'd always thought rather differently of, Hegel, for example, in commenting on Africans, says, among Negroes it is the case that consciousness has not attained even the intuition of any sort of objectivity. The Negro is the man as beast. The continued linguicide of indigenous languages in North America throughout the world today is evidence that the patterns established through conquest in the 16th century is still deeply entrenched in our own minds and most certainly in our higher education institutions. The problem that arises from the domination of Western knowledge system is not only that the ways of knowing, the cultures and the stories of the majority of people of the world are excluded, but that given the Western knowledge narrative that links with some form of knowledge about progress, science, and the future, it looks as though colonialism has disabled the global North from learning in non-colonial terms. Is the global North stuck in a rut of history's path that will not allow us to understand the existence of histories other than the universal history of the West? Rajesh and I have been working around a discourse which we call knowledge democracy, and when we talk about knowledge democracy, we're talking about several phenomena. First, this came about because we've been working in these international circles on policy issues, and everybody's always talking about the knowledge economy, or sometimes about the knowledge society, and we found ourselves deeply, unrepresented intellectually by either of those discourses. Knowledge economy has really been captured totally by the market. It's simply a market, gimmick for talking about how to train up people for the global assembly line. Knowledge society is a little bit better because it talks about the role of knowledge and citizenship and participation, but it doesn't question the Western canon. It's perfectly happy. The assumption is that we know quite a lot, about all this stuff, and it's just a matter of getting it out, some of this good Western knowledge out into those people who haven't benefited, and then they'll be more democratic. Knowledge democracy then refers to an interrelationship of phenomena. First, it acknowledges the importance of the existence of multiple epistemologies or ways of knowing, such as organic, spiritual, land-based systems, frameworks arriving from social movements, and the knowledge of the marginalized and excluded everywhere, or what is sometimes referred to as subaltern knowledge. Second, knowledge democracy affirms that knowledge is both created and represented in multiple forms, including text, image, numbers, but also story, music, drama, poetry, ceremony, meditation, and more. Third, and fundamental to our thinking about knowledge democracy, is the understanding that knowledge is a powerful tool, a powerful ingredient in movements and the organizing of people to take action elsewhere to deepen democracy and to struggle for a fairer or a healthier, more sustainable, more just world. Finally, a knowledge democracy is about open access for the sharing of knowledge so that everyone who needs knowledge will have access to it. Knowledge democracy, taken all together, is about linking the values of justice, fairness, and action to the process of using knowledge. Now, I'm just going to say one digression. I love books. I've published a lot of books. I buy books all the time, and I salivate when I see a display of books. But I have a message, my friends. I particularly think for the senior ones among us who already have tenure and so forth. We've got to stop publishing with these market publishers. Because if you go out to that table, including one of my own books out there, if you go out to that table, this is a mouth-watering array of progressive, transformative ideas. And many, many of the people here in this room have contributed. If you turn the books over and look at the price, you'll find there's one, I think, for $19, which is a pretty good deal. There are others that are reaching upwards of $300. We have to stop that. Rajesh and I made a pledge last year because we'd worked on quite a few books in the last little while. Just total ignorance about all of this stuff about price points. And we got the books done. We went around, telling everybody, here's some cool books, you really get some support from these books. And they said, oh, how much are they? And we looked and, that's at $90. We were so embarrassed. So embarrassed. We are only going to publish open access from now on. And I really urge all of you to think about it. It's going to change. I know some of you will say, well, can't get tenure on an open access book. That's not necessarily the case. The thing is going to change. Anyway, you can see my point. But we are also, how long does a session go? Till 2:40. Well, but I want some time for questions here. So let me just try to wrap it up a little bit. I'll shorten some of this part. So one of the things that I'm a big believer in is not enough just to critique. We have to create as scholars. And I think that particularly as social scientists and people working in the humanities, we are really good at critique. Wow. You know, the hair stands on the back of my neck when I hear some of the, or read some of the powerful passage that many of you in this room have written. I just love that. I could go to sleep reading this stuff. But it's not enough. It's not enough. Yes. Nicely said. In my dreams. Well, that maybe is a good that I said it that way. So I tend to be. I also think that we have to be. We have to think about, you know, what are we going to do? So what? You know, are we just going to stand, or are we going to do like Mark and Jim and these people here at Regina, organize a conference of people who really are unhappy, are mad as hell, and don't want to take it anymore? Nobody asked them to do that. Not even President Thomas. Nobody asked them to do that. They decided to do it. They did it, and we're here. Yes. So I think that we are also. I'm part of those believers in what some guy called David Corton calls the Great Turning. And I think the evidence of that is, you know, if you look at the Occupy movement, or here in Canada, the Idle No More movement, or the anti-austerity movements in Europe, or you look at the scholars like Piketty, or that Oxfam report on inequality, Wilkinson, and even the Pope. Even the Pope is talking about the global capitalism as, this is a quote, I would never say this, dung of the devil. Dung of the devil. Wow, when have you heard anybody talk about global capitalism? I think Ivana came closest to that kind of poetic this morning. So my feeling is that we have a lot of opportunities. And so what are some of the, I don't know if lights at the end of the tunnel, or some sort of transformative things that are happening? And I've got a few, and I'm sure that if we had a session where we were, sat together and kind of brainstormed, some of the what is the new vision, of a new kind of transformative higher education that fit some of these things, we would come up with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories. There are new higher education narratives that are emerging. The Global University Network for Innovation in 2014 brought out a book called Knowledge, Engagement, and Higher Education Contributing to Social Change. And in it, it's a world report on just this kind of stuff that we're talking about, but from about 70 countries, lots of authors, and is all going on all over the world. There's a multi-world network based in India, and also working with scholars in Malaysia, who are working on, it's a network for decolonizing academic curricula, ridding them of Eurocentric biases, and they have staged 6 international conferences and located in Asia, Africa, South America, and India. And the work of that network has actually received support from the Ministry of Education in Malaysia. Interesting. They have a text that's emerging, a kind of a declaration called Decolonizing the University, the Emerging Quest for Non-European Paradigms. There's also work being done, and we've heard some of it this morning, around the decolonization of established universities. The fact that that Mark and his colleagues were able to organize a session like this at the University of Regina is proof that there is a space for having a dialogue in our higher education institutions around the meaning of decolonization. In today's conference, today and tomorrow, it's about higher education, but there could be similar conferences in nursing and engineering and social work and you name it, because the issues are similar in whose knowledge is there and who isn't. We have at the University of Victoria, we're working hard. We have a long ways to go, and I think it's very easy. I really take Marie's kind of caution around how easy it is to talk about these things, but the actual getting into the depth of what does it mean. There's no point in increasing access to every secondary Indigenous secondary student in BC to come to the University of Victoria or any of the other universities if the curriculum is essentially the same colonial thing that it's always been. So this is a long term. It's taken 400 or 500 years for Western knowledge to achieve its ascendancy, but we're going to have to work quite a bit harder if we want to see it, changed substantially. But there is change. If I think about, 40 years ago when I started, not only would nobody have ever invited me anywhere to talk about this stuff. I remember being invited as just a new postdoc to Stanford University, where I think probably before Marie was a student there. And I gave a talk about participatory research and how, Maasai people in Tanzania knew a lot of things. And did this raise questions for the way we do research? Oh my God, I was ridden out of town on a rail. They furious with me. They're absolutely furious. To a person. I would almost said to a man. I'm looking around that room in my mind. I don't think there was a woman in that room. The work that we're going to hear, I know from Linda. Where's Linda? There she is. Hi, Linda. We're going to hear from Linda, I hope, about some of the work that she's been leading. We all know her because of her very famous book on decolonizing research methodologies, but she's also really hard at the job in an institutional sense, trying to decolonize that university where she serves as a provost. And her partner, who we know in Canada often as Graham Smith, Hingangaroa Smith, he's heading up another really important institutional, a new alternative university in Aotearoa, which is the Te Wari Wananga o Awanuiangarangi. Linda will grade me on my. But the mission statement from that university is interesting. Think about our own mission statements from my university or others. We commit ourselves to explore and define the depths of knowledge in Aotearoa to enable us to re-enrich ourselves, to know who we are, to know where we came from, and to claim our place in the future. We take this journey of discovery and reclamation of sovereignty, establishing the equality of Maori intellectual tradition alongside the knowledge base of others. Thus we can stand proudly together with all people in the world. This is part of the dream of our institution. One other story coming from Brazil. There was a fellow called Herbert de Souza, known in Brazil as Betinho, an incredible social movement organizer. And he and some other people organized a campaign on the struggle against hunger and for life. And that campaign has turned into a national network of universities. There are some 100 universities that are linked up with social movements all over, particularly northeastern Brazil, but all the way down to Rio de Janeiro. And they are working. They have mobilized all the resources of the universities together with these social movements to work against poverty. It's a remarkable study. So, questions that I ask myself is, because, if nothing else, if everybody says, well, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this, but you know what? We can still ask ourselves questions. We can all, nobody's going to tell us what we can read or we can't read, right? And probably nobody's going to ask too much about what we teach or what we don't teach. But we have a lot more freedom, to transgress than we take. And I'm urging us to transgress more and get worried less. So questions I ask myself are, how do I decolonize, deracialize, demasculinize, degender my own inherited intellectual spaces, given the powerful historical and really quite violent history of how Western knowledge became so hegemonic? How do I support the opening up of spaces for the flowering of epistemologies, ontologies, theories, and methodologies other than those that have been so long hegemonic? How do I contribute to the building of new academic cultures, more inclusive institutional cultures that genuinely respect and appreciate difference and diversity? How do I become part of creating a new architecture of knowledge that allows co-construction of knowledge between intellectuals in academia and intellectuals located in movements and other communities outside? In closing, I draw from didn't bring any of my own poetry. I wish James had have said that he was so interested. I have hours of poetry I'm sure you'd love. Anyway, we got a couple of days. I'll come back. So I'm going to draw from a poet. From this poet you probably have all heard of, is the Rabindranath Tagore. A lot of people have heard, maybe not so many, but he's a Nobel Prize winning poet from India and got his Nobel Prize in the early 20th century. He's also the founder of a university, Shantiniketan, which was built on decolonized principles, and still is in existence. Anyway, he wrote this in 1916, but when you hear it, you think, wow, 1916. He says, I know what a risk one runs in being styled an idealist in these days when the sound that drowns all voices is the noise of the marketplace. And yet, I feel that the sky and the earth and the lyrics of the dawn and the dayfall are with the poets and the idealists and not with the market men. Thank you very much. Aichka. So, as a good adult educator, I always like to leave a little bit of time for chat.
Yeah, we do have 10 minutes for further discussion and questions. I want to thank you and give you
Thank you,
a
James.
small token.
Ooh, before I finish the questions?
That's right. No wrong answer.
No wrong answers.
But please help yourself to the mic if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question.
Actually, it's just a suggestion. I loved how you said that we could all get together and brainstorm and come up with 1,000
Yes.
ideas. And I noticed that at the end of this afternoon's talks, there's these breakout things, and then there's other topics of choice. So maybe you would like to be with some people who actually wanted to do that.
Sure, I'd be happy to be with as many who would like to do that as possible. Sure. Thank you. It's a great suggestion. I mean, part of that is, I remember, who was it? Was it Beck? Who said that the ideas which will, overturn capitalism are actually carried around, perhaps in for those of us who have pockets, in our pockets or in our notebooks, or at least in our minds. We actually know a lot about, the kind of world that we would really rather have. But nobody's obviously going to ask us, because those people, they don't want the world. They're just happy the way it is. So we're going to have to, pull those ideas out of our minds ourselves and gather ourselves together, in all kinds of informal and formal ways, and make those ideas visible, because we know right now the majority of the world would rather be doing something different. Ahmed.
You did talk about the concept of knowledge and disposition.
Yes.
And you're still in a position of, how we can put it, like still the disposition is disposition.
Yes.
And you still produce knowledge and culture.
Yes.
So, I mean, what we can do to at least bridge the gaps, or trying to find some ways to reproduce knowledge from those dispositions.
Well, one of the things that, of course, that we're fortunate here in Canada, in that, in spite of the genocidal, intentions of the colonial Canadians, which continues in many ways today, in spite of all of that, Indigenous people are still here, and recovering voice and working, really cleverly. And I think that, some of us who have been able to, learn from, from our, Indigenous sisters and brothers who are working in this kind of struggle, starting back, a long time ago, but it's picking up some momentum in many of our universities, particularly in Western Canada. So I think that I think that, first of all, I think we have to recognize, we have to recognize that the knowledge, the body of knowledge which is being taught in my university in Victoria, is very similar to what's being taught at this university. And you wouldn't be surprised to know it's very similar to what's been taught in Germany. It's very similar to what's being taught in India. It's very similar to what's been taught in, all over the world. There isn't, there's no University of Victoria in that sense, or university. There is this Western, monopoly, this conquest, the epistemological, ideological conquest has been so total that people forget. They think that this is, that all we have to do, if you want to be a good, Brazilian, is learn the same theory that, somebody learns at University of Victoria. So we have to, those of us who are starting to tweak to this, and it's hard to, it's like, who was it was telling us about the fish doesn't understand the concept of water? Who was that? Who was that? Somebody was telling us a joke about one fish talking to the other, how's the water? And the other fish was saying, what water? Because we're floating, we're so immersed in that body of knowledge, we don't feel the water. We don't feel it. And so we have to put ourselves in spaces of discomfort. When I say now, I'm talking about kind of, dominant culture, settler type of old guys like me. We have to put ourselves in places where we're not just, so comforted by everything around us. So the higher education, one of the biggest challenges is precisely, that's why this conference is so important. And we have to have this conference, the idea of this conference has to be multiplied in our other places, and it has to be repeated, and we have to build on this kind of thing. And there may be other spaces like this that I'm not aware of. Because we have to really get it, that it's not okay to continue along the same lines. This Western body of knowledge, it's not okay. It's not because it's not fair. It isn't fair. It isn't fair. But it's not going to work. Look at the mess. Look at the mess we're in. We heard, Ivana gave us all this stuff about, all the terrible things that are happening in the world. Our country's burning up. It's all catch on fire because we have a country that doesn't believe in anything other than price of petroleum. So then there's a lot of other issues that cannot be solved. The complexity of the world is such that trying to work from a knowledge base which is narrow, and historically limited to a particular set of ideas and constructs, really 500 years old, mostly white boys, it's just not going to work. So there's justice reasons, there's a lot of other things. Yes, sir.
Last question.
I love your message, and as another white guy who is the occupier of multiple sites of privilege,
yes.
I'd like to just tease out one of the key components of your message as we're looking for answers to contest the hegemony of the current historical conjuncture. You reference acquisition through dispossession, yes. And David Harvey. David Harvey is a Marxist geographer who has taught in some of the elite institutions in the world. He's been allowed to be a Marxist geographer. He is allowed to make the Marxist tradition and his critique of capital a central defining part of his life's work. He occupies a position inside the discipline of geography, and geography, the imperialism and colonialism's acquisitions were attended and fueled and formalized through the discipline of cartography. That is, geography was a deeply complicitous with acquisition through dispossession. And yet, that site of privilege can also be the site of willing relinquishment, rethinking, and revisionary. So there are multiple sites of possibility in which we can take up the call that you've made and make it live effectively. So thank you very much.
That's great. And I just would say one thing. That's an excellent point. The other thing, though, is that David, I don't know him, but I mean, I've followed his work. He's one of the guys I really love to read his stuff. David is as good as it gets in terms of old white men as allies and leading the way on deconstructing the problems in the world. But David is not part of kind of the reimagining of the university. And the university has great tolerance. The university we should ask almost without an exception. I think Peter McLaren's struggle with UCLA is an interesting story. He got just a little bit too carried away, and UCLA really came down on him. But for the most part, universities are quite tolerant of left wing or alternative or progressive or whatever it is, activist scholars, as long as they don't start to propose new ways of organizing the university. And so what we have to do is we have to take the lessons of David, and we have to keep those and keep building on those, keep strengthening our critical capacity. But we now have to also work on the creative side. What are we going to create? Maybe it's only in our own classroom. Maybe we can have a new course. Maybe we can get, if you get like Linda and Graham, maybe you get access to a whole university to try and change. But we have to move into that space, that constructing the new. We have to get to the world we want.